The temperature drops to -20 in the Yukon backcountry, and Marcus Chen watches his breath crystallize in the air as his stomach gnaws at itself for the third straight day. His hiking group vanished after the whiteout blizzard, their GPS useless, their emergency beacon dead. Most teenagers would panic, curl up, and wait for rescue that might never come. But Marcus isn't most teenagers. While his classmates back in Seattle think he's just another video game nerd, they have no idea he spent every summer learning forgotten survival techniques from his ex-military grandfather in rural Montana. Now, as wolves howl in the distance and frostbite threatens his fingers, Marcus pulls out what looks like a ridiculous contraption made from dental floss and aluminum foil, something his grandfather called the stupidest trick that works every time. The other kids always laughed when he practiced it. But in this frozen wasteland, this seemingly idiotic method is about to help him catch more food in 1 hour than most survivalists manage in a week. What exactly did his grandfather teach him that defies everything you think you know about wilderness survival? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus's fingers moved with practiced precision despite the cold, assembling the contraption that had earned him endless ridicule from his hiking group just days earlier. Jake Morrison had been the worst, calling it Chen's death trap for squirrels when Marcus had demonstrated the technique around the campfire. The memory stung worse than the frozen air cutting through his inadequate jacket. 3 days ago, everything had been different. The Wilderness Leadership Academy's ultimate challenge expedition was supposed to be the capstone of their outdoor education program. 20 teenagers from across the Pacific Northwest, hand-picked for their supposed wilderness skills and leadership potential. Marcus had barely made the cut, selected more for his academic achievements than any demonstrated outdoor prowess. At least that's what everyone assumed. The irony wasn't lost on him now. While Jake and his crew had spent their presentation time bragging about their expensive gear and recounting tales of guided adventures with professional outfitters, Marcus had quietly mentioned learning a few tricks from his grandfather. They'd exchanged knowing glances, the kind that said, "Sure, whatever helps you sleep at night, city boy." The blizzard had changed everything. One moment they were following their guide along what seemed like a well-marked trail. The next, they were separated by walls of driving snow so thick Marcus couldn't see his own boots. When the wind finally died and the snow settled, he found himself completely alone in an endless expanse of white, with nothing but the emergency supplies in his day pack and the knowledge his grandfather had drilled into him summer after summer. "The thing about survival, Marcus," Grandpa Joe had said during that first summer in Montana, when Marcus was 11 and homesick and convinced he'd rather be inside playing video games, is that it ain't about the fanciest gear or the most obvious solutions. Sometimes the difference between living and dying comes down to something so simple, so seemingly stupid, that most folks would laugh at it. But dead men don't get to laugh. Most people think trapping is about strength or complicated mechanisms, Grandpa Joe had explained, his weathered hands demonstrating the technique with materials scavenged from their campsite. But the best traps work because they understand the psychology of prey. Small animals in winter are desperate, but they're also incredibly cautious. You've got to give them something that looks like opportunity but feels safe. The key was patience and placement. Marcus had spent the last hour studying the area, reading signs in the snow that most people would miss entirely. The tiny tracks crisscrossing near the base of the trees, the small burrows barely visible beneath the snow line, the scattered remnants of pine nuts and bark shavings that indicated regular feeding activity. He set up 3 more traps in strategic locations, each one slightly different based on the terrain and the type of prey he hoped to attract. The work kept his mind off the gnawing hunger and the very real possibility that search and rescue might never find him out here. As he finished the final trap, Marcus heard something that made his blood freeze, not the distant wolf howls he'd grown accustomed to, but the unmistakable sound of human voices carrying across the snow. For a moment, hope flared in his chest. Then he caught the tone of those voices, harsh and urgent, speaking in a language he didn't recognize. These weren't his missing hiking companions, these weren't search and rescue, and they were getting closer. The first thing Marcus noticed when he opened his eyes wasn't the pain radiating through his left shoulder, or the way his backpack straps had twisted around his torso like restraints. It was the silence. No voices calling his name, no rustling of leaves as the hiking group searched nearby trails, just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant cry of a raven somewhere above the canopy. He pushed himself up slowly, wincing as his shoulder protested. The ravine he'd tumbled into wasn't as deep as it had felt during his chaotic descent, maybe 15 feet. But the walls were steep and lined with loose shale that crumbled at the slightest touch. Above him, the trail where he'd been walking with the others seemed impossibly far away. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing weakly off the rock walls. "Anyone up there?" Nothing. Marcus checked his phone, already knowing what he'd find. No signal. The device showed 4:23 p.m., which meant he'd been unconscious for at least 20 minutes. The group would have noticed his absence by now, but in this terrain with dozens of branching trails and thick forest, they could search for hours without finding this particular crevice. He took inventory of his situation with the methodical approach his grandfather had drilled into him during their weekend camping trips. Water bottle, half full, energy bars, 3 remaining. First aid kit still sealed in his pack's side pocket. Most importantly, the small leather pouch tucked deep in his backpack's main compartment remained undamaged. The hunting slingshot inside looked innocuous enough, just leather and elastic bands that most people would dismiss as a child's toy. But Marcus had spent 2 years perfecting his aim with it, practicing on targets in Grandpa Joe's backyard until he could hit a bottle cap from 30 yards. The old man had insisted that survival sometimes required unconventional approaches, especially for someone who looked as unremarkable as Marcus did. "Size and strength aren't everything," Grandpa Joe had said during one of their training sessions. "Sometimes the quiet kid with the improvised weapon has the best chance of making it home." Marcus examined the ravine walls again, looking for handholds. The rock was too unstable to climb safely, and even if he managed to reach the top, he had no guarantee he could find his way back to the main trail. The smart move, the survival move, was to follow the ravine until it connected with water or a clearer path. He shouldered his pack and started walking. The ravine floor was uneven, scattered with fallen rocks and twisted roots that had worked their way through cracks in the stone. Marcus moved carefully, testing each step. A twisted ankle here would transform a difficult situation into a potentially fatal one. After 30 minutes of careful progress, the walls began to widen and the sound of running water reached his ears. The ravine opened into a small valley where a creek wound between moss-covered boulders. Marcus knelt beside the water and refilled his bottle, adding 2 purification tablets from his emergency kit. As he waited for the tablets to work, he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. A snowshoe hare, its coat already shifting toward winter white, sat motionless near a cluster of berry bushes 20 yards away. It hadn't detected him yet. Marcus slowly reached into his pack and withdrew the slingshot. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Smooth draw, steady breath, follow through. The shot starts in your mind, not your hands. He selected a rounded stone from the creek bed, feeling its weight. The hare was still unaware, nose twitching as it evaluated the berries. Marcus had practiced this scenario dozens of times, but always with stationary targets or hay bales, never with an actual animal that represented the difference between sustaining his energy and slowly weakening as he tried to find his way back to civilization. He drew the slingshot back slowly, muscles remembering the motion. The elastic band reached full tension just as the hare's head turned slightly, presenting a clear profile. Marcus exhaled halfway and held it, just as Grandpa Joe had taught him. The stone flew true. The hare dropped instantly, a clean hit that spoke to hours of practice and preparation. Marcus felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and regret as he approached his kill. He'd never thought his first real hunt would happen like this, alone and lost in the Alaskan wilderness. But as he field-dressed the animal using techniques learned during weekend camping trips that had seemed almost like games at the time, Marcus realized something important. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was adapting. The city kid his hiking companions had worried about was proving more resourceful than anyone had imagined, including himself. As evening approached and the temperature began to drop, Marcus gathered dry wood and prepared to make camp. Tomorrow he would continue following the creek downstream, but tonight he would eat well and stay warm. The wilderness had tested him, and he was passing. The wind had died to a whisper by the time Marcus found what he was looking for, a massive fallen spruce that had created a natural lean-to against a cluster of standing trees. The trunk was easily 4 feet in diameter, and years of weathering had stripped away most of the bark, leaving behind a silver-grey surface that would blend perfectly with the surrounding forest. Marcus circled the fallen giant twice, his grandfather's voice echoing in his memory. Never trust your first impression, boy. The wilderness will fool you every chance it gets." The old man had been right, as usual. What initially looked like perfect shelter revealed several problems upon closer inspection. The ground beneath was soggy with trapped moisture, and the prevailing wind would funnel directly into the opening. But 30 yards away, Marcus spotted something better, a depression in the earth where another tree had been uprooted, creating a natural windbreak. The exposed root system formed a partial wall on one side, and the depression would keep him below the worst of the weather. He set to work immediately, knowing he had perhaps 2 hours before full darkness. First, he gathered armloads of dry pine needles and dead branches, creating a thick bed in the center of the depression. The work warmed him, but he could feel the temperature dropping with each passing minute. The shelter itself came together quickly. Marcus had built dozens of these with Grandpa Joe during their weekend expeditions to the Cascade Mountains. Long branches leaned against the root wall, then smaller ones woven horizontally to create a framework. Pine boughs layered like shingles, starting from the bottom and working up so each layer would shed water away from the interior. As he worked, Marcus's mind kept drifting to his hiking group. By now they would have realized he was missing. Sarah would probably be crying. She cried at everything. Mr. Henderson would be trying to stay calm while internally panicking about liability lawsuits. The thought of their worry gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. Emotions were a luxury he couldn't afford right now. The shelter was nearly complete when Marcus heard it, a low grunt somewhere in the darkness beyond his small circle of vision. He froze, a pine bough halfway to the roof frame. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Bear. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands remained steady. Grandpa Joe had prepared him for this too. Fear is just information, Marcus. Use it. Don't let it use you. Moving slowly, Marcus reached for his backpack and pulled out the one item he'd been saving, a small emergency flare. Not to signal for help, but for exactly this situation. He kept his movements minimal, knowing that sudden motion might trigger an aggressive response from whatever was out there. The sounds grew closer. Definitely something big, probably a black bear based on the grunting and the way it moved through the brush. Marcus could smell it now, a musky, wild scent that made his primitive brain scream warnings. A shadow shifted at the edge of his vision, and Marcus caught a glimpse of a dark bulk moving between the trees. The bear was investigating his scent trail, probably drawn by the smell of his energy bars or the soap he'd used that morning. Marcus waited until the sounds indicated the bear was about 20 feet away. Then he struck the flare against its ignition strip. The sudden burst of red light and hissing sparks lit up the forest like a scene from hell. The bear let out a startled woof and crashed away through the underbrush, breaking branches in its haste to escape. Marcus kept the flare burning until it was nearly spent, waving it around to spread his scent and the chemical smell as widely as possible. Most bears wouldn't return after a scare like that, but he wasn't taking chances. When the flare finally died, the darkness seemed absolute by comparison. Marcus finished his shelter by feel, then crawled inside and sealed the entrance with a final layer of pine boughs. The space was barely large enough for him to lie down, but it was dry and already noticeably warmer than the outside air. He allowed himself half of one energy bar and a few sips of water, then settled in for what he knew would be a long night. Through the walls of his shelter, he could hear the forest coming alive around him, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the groan of trees swaying in the wind. For the first time since falling into the ravine, Marcus smiled. He was cold, hungry, and completely alone in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. But he was alive, he had shelter, and he had a plan. Tomorrow he would begin the real work of survival. Tonight he would rest and let his body recover from the day's ordeal. The wilderness had tested him once and found him worthy. It wouldn't be the last test. The temperature dropped 15 degrees as the sun disappeared behind the jagged peaks, and Marcus could feel the familiar bite of Alaskan cold seeping through his layers. He'd been walking for 3 hours since leaving the cave, following what he hoped was an old game trail that wound through a valley between two ridgelines. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, "Never travel in the dark unless it's life or death. The wilderness doesn't forgive mistakes." This wasn't life or death yet, but Marcus could feel it approaching like a distant storm. His water was running low, and the energy bars wouldn't last another day. The rational part of his mind whispered that he should find shelter and wait for rescue, but a deeper instinct told him that rescue wasn't coming. Not in time. He pressed forward as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, scanning for any sign of shelter. The terrain was becoming more challenging, loose scree slopes that threatened to send him tumbling, and thick patches of alder that forced him to backtrack and find new routes. Just as full darkness began to settle, he spotted something that made his heart race, a thin column of smoke rising from behind a cluster of spruce trees about half a mile ahead. Marcus froze, every sense heightening. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. But out here, people could be salvation or danger. Hunters, hikers, researchers, or something worse. He'd heard stories from his grandfather about the kind of men who disappeared into the Alaskan wilderness to escape the law, living off the grid in hidden camps. Moving carefully through the trees, Marcus approached the source of the smoke. The scent of burning wood mixed with something else, coffee and bacon. His stomach clenched with hunger so sharp it was almost painful. Through a gap in the trees he could see a small cabin, smoke curling from a metal chimney. Warm yellow light glowed in the windows, and he could make out the shadow of someone moving inside. He crouched behind a fallen log, weighing his options. His grandfather had taught him that desperation made men stupid, but sometimes you had to take calculated risks. This person had shelter, food, and probably communication equipment. They might be his ticket home. But as Marcus studied the scene more carefully, details began to trouble him. The cabin looked too isolated, too hidden. There was no visible road or trail leading to it, just a narrow ATV track that seemed to wind deeper into the wilderness. A generator hummed quietly beside the building, and he could see what looked like surveillance cameras mounted under the eaves. Then the door opened, and a man stepped out onto the small porch. Even in the dim light, Marcus could see he was tall and lean, wearing military-style clothing. The man stood perfectly still for several minutes, scanning the tree line with the practiced alertness of someone accustomed to danger. When he turned slightly, Marcus caught a glimpse of his face, scarred and weathered with the hard eyes of someone who'd seen violence. The man called out into the darkness, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I know someone's out there. Been watching my trail cameras for the last hour. You can come in and get warm, or you can freeze to death in the trees. Your choice." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. Trail cameras. The man had been watching him approach. This wasn't a chance encounter. It was a trap he'd walked right into. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but the man's next words stopped him cold. "Saw the search helicopters earlier. You must be that missing kid from the hiking group. They called off the search about 2 hours ago. said it was too dangerous to continue in the dark. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. The search was called off. He was truly on his own now. The man on the porch knew exactly who he was and how desperate his situation had become. "Name's Dale," the man continued, his tone conversational but somehow menacing. "Been living out here for 6 years. Don't get many visitors, especially not lost teenagers who need help getting home." Marcus remained frozen behind the log, his mind racing. This man could be his salvation or his doom, and he had no way to tell which. His grandfather's training had prepared him for many things, but not for this kind of human threat. In the wild, predators were predictable. They followed instinct and opportunity. But human predators were different. They were cunning, patient, and infinitely more dangerous. The man took one last look around the tree line before stepping back inside, leaving the door pointedly open. Warm light spilled out into the darkness, along with the tantalizing smell of food and the promise of warmth. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to think. Stay and freeze, or take his chances with a stranger who might be his only hope of survival. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since dawn, and Marcus could see his breath forming small clouds as he worked. His fingers, despite the makeshift gloves he'd fashioned from his torn jacket sleeves, were starting to lose sensation. But he couldn't afford to stop now. The slingshot was nearly complete. He'd found the perfect Y-shaped branch from a birch tree, flexible enough to handle tension, but strong enough not to snap under pressure. The surgical tubing from his first aid kit, something Grandad Jack had insisted he always carry, would provide the power he needed. Most people used those emergency kits for bandages and antiseptic. Jack had taught him to see every item as a potential survival tool. Resources, Marcus. He could hear his grandfather's gravelly voice in his head. Everything around you is a resource if you know how to look at it. The irony wasn't lost on him that while his classmates back in Seattle were probably sleeping in until noon on this Saturday morning, he was sitting in sub-freezing wilderness, crafting weapons from medical supplies. 3 months ago, he'd been complaining about having to wake up at 6 a.m. for cross-country practice. Marcus carefully attached the tubing to the birch fork, using dental floss from his pack to secure the connections. The floss was stronger than most people realized, strong enough to be used as fishing line or, in this case, as binding material that wouldn't snap under stress. Another one of Jack's unconventional lessons. A branch snapped somewhere behind him, and Marcus froze. He'd been so focused on his work that he'd let his guard down, exactly the kind of mistake that got people killed out here. Slowly, he turned his head, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but that didn't mean nothing was there. Bears were still active this time of year, preparing for winter. Wolves traveled in packs and could take down prey much larger than a 16-year-old boy. Even a moose, seemingly harmless, could trample him to death if it felt threatened. Marcus remained motionless for a full 2 minutes, listening. The wilderness had its own rhythm, its own sounds. Birds, wind through branches, the distant trickle of water over rocks. But underneath it all was something else, a presence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Moving as quietly as possible, Marcus gathered his materials and slipped behind a large pine tree. His slingshot wasn't finished, but it might have to do. He loaded a smooth stone he'd collected from the stream bed and drew back the surgical tubing, testing the tension. A grey shape moved between the trees 50 yards away. Wolf. And where there was one, there were usually others. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands remained steady. Jack had drilled this into him during their training sessions in the Olympic Mountains. Fear keeps you alive, but panic kills you. Feel the fear, acknowledge it, then put it aside and think. The wolf hadn't spotted him yet. It was moving parallel to his position, nose to the ground, following some scent trail. Marcus couldn't tell if it was tracking him or something else, but he wasn't about to wait around to find out. He had 2 options: stay hidden and hope it passed by, or create a distraction and move to higher ground. The tree he was behind was too thick to climb quickly, and if there were more wolves in the pack, they could surround him while he was exposed. Marcus made his choice. He aimed the slingshot not at the wolf, but at a cluster of branches 20 feet to its left. The stones struck with a sharp crack, and the wolf's head snapped toward the sound. In that moment of distraction, Marcus moved. He sprinted toward a rocky outcrop he'd noticed earlier, his boots slipping slightly on the wet leaves but maintaining his balance. Behind him, he heard the wolf's questioning whine, then the rustle of movement as it investigated the noise. The rocks provided better elevation and fewer approach angles for predators. Marcus scrambled up the natural formation until he found a ledge that offered both protection and visibility. From this vantage point, he could see the wolf clearly, a large male, probably weighing close to 100 pounds. But it wasn't alone. 2 more shapes emerged from the forest, and Marcus felt his stomach clench. A pack. The wolves seemed confused by his scent trail, circling the area where he'd been working on his slingshot. The alpha lifted his head, nostrils flaring, trying to pinpoint the source. His yellow eyes swept the landscape methodically. Marcus pressed himself against the rock face, making himself as small as possible. The stone was cold against his back, leaching warmth from his body, but he didn't dare move. One of the younger wolves looked directly at his hiding spot. For a heart-stopping moment, their eyes met across the distance. The wolf tilted its head, considering. Then, from somewhere deeper in the forest, came a howl that made Marcus's blood freeze. The pack had found something else, something that interested them more than the strange scent of a human boy. The 3 wolves turned as one and loped away into the wilderness, leaving Marcus alone with the sound of his own ragged breathing and the growing certainty that his real test of survival was just beginning. The storm hit with a vengeance just as Marcus finished securing his shelter. What had started as gentle snowfall an hour earlier now howled through the trees like a living thing, driving ice crystals horizontally across the mountainside. He crouched low and duck-walked into his hastily constructed lean-to, grateful for every minute his grandfather had made him practice building emergency shelters in their backyard. The wind shrieked overhead, bending the spruce trees until their tops nearly touched the ground. Marcus pulled his knees to his chest and wrapped his arms around them, trying to conserve body heat. His shelter held but barely. Each gust threatened to tear away the carefully woven branches and pine boughs that formed his only barrier against the elements. Through the chaos he heard something that made his blood freeze, a low, rumbling sound that cut through even the storm's fury. Bear. And it was close. Marcus forced himself to breathe slowly, remembering his grandfather's voice. Panic kills faster than cold, faster than hunger, faster than anything else out here. He pressed his eye to a gap between the branches and peered into the swirling white darkness. A massive brown shape materialized from the storm, moving with surprising grace through the deep snow. The grizzly was enormous, probably 8 feet tall when it occasionally reared up on its hind legs to test the air. Marcus watched, transfixed, as the bear methodically searched the area, its powerful nose working overtime despite the driving snow. The bear was hunting, and Marcus suddenly realized what it was hunting for. Earlier, when he'd cleaned the fish he'd caught, he'd been careful to wash his hands in the stream and bury the scraps far from his shelter, just like Grandpa Joe had taught him. But the storm had probably uncovered his cache, and now the scent was drawing this apex predator straight toward him. The grizzly moved closer, its massive paws leaving dinner plate-sized tracks in the snow. 20 yards. 15. Marcus could hear its heavy breathing now, see the ice crystals forming on its dark fur. His heart hammered so hard he was certain the bear could hear it. Then the animal stopped directly in front of his shelter and lifted its head, sniffing deeply. Marcus held his breath, every muscle in his body coiled tight. The bear's small, dark eyes seemed to look right through the branches at him. For a moment that felt like an eternity, predator and prey regarded each other through the storm. The grizzly took a step forward, then another. Its massive head dropped low, nose nearly touching the ground where Marcus had walked earlier. The scent trail was still there, hidden beneath the fresh snow but unmistakable to the bear's sensitive nose. Marcus's hand slowly crept toward his backpack, where his grandfather's old survival knife waited in its leather sheath. The blade would be useless against a creature this size, but having it in his hand made him feel slightly less helpless. His fingers closed around the worn handle. The bear circled his shelter once, then twice, moving with deliberate patience. Snow accumulated on its broad back as it investigated every inch of Marcus's small camp. When it passed close to the shelter's entrance, Marcus caught a glimpse of its massive claws, each one longer than his fingers, and designed for tearing through flesh and bone. A particularly violent gust of wind caught the bear's attention, and it turned toward the sound. Marcus seized the moment, shifting his weight as quietly as possible to peer through a different gap in his shelter. He needed to know where the animal was at all times. But as he moved, his boot scraped against a loose branch, creating the faintest whisper of sound. In the wilderness, such tiny noises carried enormous weight. The bear's head snapped around instantly, fixing on the exact spot where Marcus crouched. There was no doubt now. It knew he was there. For several heartbeats, neither moved. Marcus could see his own breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, and he wondered if the bear could see them too. The storm continued to rage around them, but the space between boy and bear seemed suspended in deadly silence. Then, without warning, the grizzly charged. Marcus rolled sideways just as massive claws raked through his shelter, sending branches and pine boughs flying in every direction. The bear's roar drowned out even the storm's fury as it tore through the structure like tissue paper. Marcus scrambled backward through the snow, knife in hand, as 800 pounds of muscle and fury destroyed his only protection from the elements. The bear spun toward him with surprising speed, eyes locked on its target. Marcus could see every detail of its face now, the scarred muzzle, the yellowed teeth, the primal intelligence that marked him as prey. He raised the knife with both hands, knowing it was inadequate, but refusing to go down without a fight. The grizzly reared up on its hind legs, towering above him like a furry mountain of death, and Marcus realized that everything his grandfather had taught him might not be enough to save his life. The smell hit Marcus before he saw anything else, a putrid, overwhelming stench that made his eyes water and his stomach lurch. He pressed his sleeve against his nose and mouth, forcing himself to breathe through the fabric as he crept forward through the dense undergrowth. 20 yards ahead, through a gap in the spruce trees, he spotted the source. A massive bull moose lay on its side, its antlers twisted at an unnatural angle against a fallen log. The carcass was maybe 3 days old, judging by the bloating and the cloud of flies that rose and fell like a dark blanket. But more importantly, it wasn't alone. A brown bear, easily 7 feet tall, stood over the kill with its back to Marcus. The animal's massive shoulders rippled as it tore chunks of meat from the moose's hindquarters, completely absorbed in its feast. Every few seconds it would lift its head to scan the area, then return to feeding with single-minded intensity. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. This was exactly what Grandpa Joe had taught him to look for. A predator distracted by an easy meal, focused entirely on protecting its prize rather than hunting. The old man's voice echoed in his memory. Sometimes the best way to catch a predator is to let it catch something else first. Moving with excruciating care, Marcus backed away until he was well out of sight, then began a wide circle around the feeding site. The wind was in his favor, blowing from the bear toward him, which meant his scent wouldn't give him away. But it also meant the overwhelming stench of decay followed him as he moved. He found what he was looking for about 100 yards downwind, a cluster of boulders that formed a natural blind with clear sightlines to the kill site. More importantly, it offered multiple escape routes if things went wrong. Grandpa Joe's first rule: always have an exit strategy. Marcus settled behind the largest boulder and began the waiting game. This was the part that separated real hunters from weekend warriors, the ability to remain perfectly still for hours while every muscle screamed for movement. He'd spent countless afternoons in the woods behind his grandfather's cabin, learning to become invisible, to think like prey while acting like a predator. The brown bear continued feeding, occasionally lifting its massive head to survey its territory with small, intelligent eyes. Marcus studied the animal's movements, looking for patterns, for the rhythm that would tell him when to act. Grandpa Joe had taught him that every predator had habits, predictable behaviors that could be exploited by someone patient enough to observe. As the afternoon wore on, other scavengers began to arrive. First came the ravens, calling to each other from the treetops in harsh, guttural voices. Then a red fox appeared at the edge of the clearing, its body language tense and ready to bolt. The bear largely ignored these smaller competitors, secure in its dominance over the kill. But Marcus wasn't interested in the bear anymore. His attention had shifted to something far more valuable: fresh water. About 50 yards from the kill site, he'd spotted a small creek that the animals were using. Every 20 minutes or so, one of the scavengers would break away to drink, following what appeared to be a well-worn game trail. That trail was his opportunity. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows through the forest, Marcus made his move. He worked his way around to a position near the creek, upstream from where the animals drank. Here, the water ran clear and cold over a bed of smooth stones, untainted by the carnage downstream. He set up his trap with materials gathered throughout the day, a deadfall snare using techniques his grandfather had shown him, but modified for smaller prey. Not everything in the wilderness was massive and dangerous. Sometimes survival meant thinking smaller, being satisfied with what you could actually catch rather than dreaming of impossible victories. The trap was simple but effective, a heavy log balanced on a trigger stick, positioned over the narrow part of the trail where animals would naturally step. Beneath it, he scattered some berries he'd found earlier, not as bait for large predators, but to attract the smaller creatures that would come to drink once the bear moved on. By the time darkness began to creep through the trees, Marcus had retreated to a secondary position where he could monitor both the trap and the kill site. The brown bear was still feeding, but less aggressively now, its belly visibly distended. Soon it would either bed down near its prize or wander off to digest, leaving opportunities for smaller scavengers. Marcus settled in for another long wait, his body aching from the day's careful stalking, but his mind sharp with purpose. This wasn't the dramatic confrontation some might imagine, no desperate battle between man and beast. Instead, it was exactly what his grandfather had trained him for: patience, observation, and the wisdom to work with the wilderness rather than against it. The first stars were beginning to appear through the forest canopy when he heard the sharp crack of the trigger stick snapping. The rabbit's blood had barely dried on Marcus's hands when he heard the distant rumble of an engine. His heart leaped, then immediately sank as he recognized the sound, too steady, too purposeful to be a rescue vehicle. This was something else entirely. He quickly gathered his makeshift sling and the rabbit, retreating deeper into the cluster of spruce trees that had sheltered him through the night. The engine grew louder, accompanied now by the crunch of heavy tires over loose gravel and underbrush. Through the dense branches, Marcus caught glimpses of a modified ATV painted in mottled greens and browns, cutting through the wilderness with practiced ease. The vehicle stopped less than 50 yards from his hiding spot. Marcus held his breath as two men climbed off, their movements deliberate and quiet. Even from this distance, he could see they weren't part of any official search party. No bright safety colors, no radio chatter, no calling his name. Instead, they wore military-style clothing and moved with the fluid coordination of people who'd spent serious time in hostile territory. "Tracks lead this way," the taller one said, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. "Fresh boot prints. Size looks about right." Marcus's stomach dropped. They were tracking him. But why? Who were these people, and what did they want with a lost teenager? The shorter man knelt near where Marcus had built his fire the previous evening. "Kid knows what he's doing. Fire pits properly constructed, minimal smoke signature. This isn't some panicked city boy stumbling around." "Intel was right then," the tall one replied, adjusting something on his belt that looked suspiciously like a weapon. The grandfather really did train him. The words hit Marcus like ice water. They knew about Grandpa Joe. This wasn't a coincidence or a case of mistaken identity. Somehow these men were specifically hunting him, and they knew about his survival training. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory from their last training session. Sometimes the most dangerous predator walks on two legs, Marcus. When that happens, everything changes. You're not just surviving, you're at war. Marcus forced himself to think clearly despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The men were studying his trail, which meant they'd follow it to this grove soon enough. He needed to move, but running blindly would only make him easier to track. Instead, he needed to use every trick Grandpa Joe had taught him. Carefully, silently, he began backing away through the thickest part of the underbrush, placing each step with deliberate precision to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. The rabbit went into his backpack along with his sling. He'd need both hands free for what came next. "Trail goes toward those trees," the shorter man announced. Marcus was already 50 yards deeper into the forest, moving parallel to a small creek he'd discovered earlier. Grandpa Joe had drilled into him that water was both friend and enemy. It could mask your scent and muffle sounds, but it could also trap you if you weren't careful. He found what he was looking for, a fallen log spanning the creek, thick enough to support his weight but positioned, where the flowing water would mask any sound of his crossing. As he carefully made his way across, Marcus's mind raced through possibilities. These men obviously had resources and training, but they were operating in his element now. The wilderness didn't care about their equipment or their experience with conventional tactics. On the far side of the creek, Marcus began implementing one of his grandfather's more advanced lessons. Instead of continuing in a straight line, he started a complex evasion pattern, doubling back on his own trail, using rocky ground to mask his footprints, and deliberately creating false trails that would waste their time. Behind him, he could hear the men entering the grove where he'd hidden. Their voices carried a note of frustration now. Lost the trail in all this undergrowth. He can't have gone far. Fan out, check the creek bed. Marcus allowed himself a grim smile. They were thinking like hunters pursuing wounded prey, not realizing that their quarry had just shifted tactics entirely. While they wasted time searching the obvious escape routes, he was already implementing a plan that would take him miles from their search area. But first, he needed answers. Who were these people? What did they want? And how much danger was he really in? He found a vantage point on a ridge overlooking the grove and settled in to watch. The men were methodical but increasingly frustrated as they failed to pick up his trail. More telling was their equipment. Definitely military grade, definitely expensive. This wasn't some random encounter. One of them spoke into a radio. "Target has gone to ground. He's better trained than anticipated. We're going to need more time." Target. The word confirmed Marcus's worst fears. Whatever this was about, he wasn't getting rescued today. He was being hunted by professionals who wanted him for reasons he couldn't begin to understand. The wilderness had just become a battlefield. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline morning that made every snow-laden branch sparkle like diamonds. Marcus emerged from his shelter, stretching muscles that had grown stiff from the cold night. His breath formed white puffs in the frigid air as he surveyed his surroundings with fresh eyes. 3 days alone in the Alaskan wilderness had changed him. The soft city kid who'd stumbled away from the hiking trail was gone, replaced by someone harder, more focused. His grandfather's training had become second nature now, each lesson flowing through his actions without conscious thought. The rabbit snares he'd set the previous evening had yielded nothing, but Marcus wasn't discouraged. Grandpa Joe had taught him that patience was a hunter's greatest virtue. Still, his stomach gnawed at itself with increasing urgency, reminding him that the handful of berries from yesterday wouldn't sustain him much longer. He broke down his shelter methodically, packing the usable materials into his makeshift pack. The rescue teams would be looking for him, but Marcus had learned enough about search patterns to know they were probably focusing their efforts miles from his actual location. The storm had covered his tracks and changed the landscape, making him nearly impossible to find. As he prepared to move deeper into the valley, a sound made him freeze. Not the whisper of wind through pines or the distant crack of settling ice, but something else, something deliberate. Marcus crouched behind a fallen log, his senses suddenly hyper-alert. Through the trees, perhaps 50 yards away, he caught a glimpse of movement. Brown fur, massive shoulders, a distinctive hump. Grizzly bear. His heart hammered against his ribs as every survival instinct screamed at him to run. But Grandpa Joe's voice echoed in his memory. Running from a grizzly is like ringing the dinner bell. You become prey the moment you flee. The bear hadn't noticed him yet. It was focused on something else, digging at the base of a large pine tree, probably after grubs or roots, Marcus realized. He began backing away slowly, each movement calculated and controlled. 1 step, 2, 3, the bear's head snapped up. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, predator and human stared at each other across the snowy clearing. The grizzly was enormous, easily 7 feet tall even on all fours. Its dark eyes held an intelligence that made Marcus's skin crawl. Then the bear stood up on its hind legs, towering nearly 10 feet high, testing the air with its sensitive nose. Marcus remained absolutely still, barely breathing, praying the wind wouldn't shift and carry his scent. The grizzly dropped back to all fours and took a step toward him. Marcus's mind raced through his options. His grandfather had drilled him on bear encounters countless times, but theory felt inadequate when facing 800 pounds of muscle and claws. He could try to make himself appear larger, speak in calm tones, back away slowly. Or he could use the unconventional method Grandpa Joe had shown him, the one that had seemed crazy until now. The bear took another step forward, its massive paws crushing the snow with audible crunches. Moving with agonizing slowness, Marcus reached into his pack and withdrew the small mirror he'd salvaged from his backpack days ago. His hands trembled as he angled it to catch the morning sunlight streaming through the canopy. The bright reflection danced across the snow between them. The grizzly stopped, its head tilting with curiosity. Marcus had seen the technique work on Grandpa Joe's property with black bears, but never anything this large or dangerous. He moved the mirror slightly, making the light spot dance left and right. The bear's attention locked onto the moving reflection. It approached the glowing patch on the snow, sniffing cautiously. When the light shifted away, the massive animal actually followed it, like an enormous, deadly cat chasing a laser pointer. "That's right," Marcus whispered under his breath, slowly backing away while keeping the mirror steady. Just a harmless little light. Step by step, he led the grizzly away from his position, using the reflection to guide its attention in the opposite direction from where he needed to go. The bear seemed genuinely fascinated by the dancing spot of sunlight pouring at it when it lingered too long in one place. When Marcus had put nearly 100 yards between himself and the bear, he gradually faded the reflection by angling the mirror away. The grizzly stood for a moment, looking confused, then ambled back toward its original digging spot. Marcus didn't stop moving until the bear was completely out of sight. Only then did he allow himself to collapse against a tree, his legs shaking from adrenaline and relief. "Thanks, Grandpa Joe," he whispered to the wilderness around him. The encounter had cost him precious time and energy, but it had also taught him something important. He was capable of more than mere survival out here. He could adapt, improvise, overcome challenges that would have seemed impossible just days ago. With renewed confidence, Marcus shouldered his pack and continued deeper into the valley, following a game trail that wound between towering spruces toward an uncertain but no longer hopeless future. The storm hit with the fury of a living thing, turning the world into a howling white void that seemed determined to erase Marcus from existence. He pressed himself against the back wall of his shelter, feeling the entire structure shudder with each gust of wind that threatened to tear it apart. Snow drove through the smallest gaps in his construction, creating tiny drifts inside what should have been his sanctuary. The wind's pitch changed, becoming a banshee wail that made his teeth ache. Marcus had never experienced anything like this. His grandfather's stories of Alaskan blizzards had seemed like tall tales designed to impress a city kid, But now he understood that the old man had probably understated the reality. This wasn't just weather, it was nature showing him exactly how small and vulnerable he really was. He tried to conserve his body heat by doing isometric exercises in the cramped space, tensing and releasing his muscles in rhythm. His grandfather had taught him this technique during a winter camping trip in the Cascades, but that experience felt like a tropical vacation compared to this Arctic nightmare. The cold seemed to seep through every layer of clothing, finding ways to reach his skin despite his careful preparations. The darkness was absolute. Even with his small flashlight, he could barely see 2 feet in front of his face. The beam seemed to be swallowed by the swirling snow and ice crystals that filled the air. Marcus rationed the light carefully, knowing his batteries wouldn't last forever, and settled into a routine of brief illumination every few minutes to check his surroundings. His water bottles had frozen solid, forcing him to keep one pressed against his body to maintain a small amount of liquid water. The process was uncomfortable and inefficient, but dehydration would kill him faster than the cold if he wasn't careful. He melted small amounts of snow in his mouth, though his grandfather had warned him this would lower his core temperature dangerously if done too often. Around what he guessed was midnight, the shelter began to list to one side. The wind had found a weak point in his construction, and Marcus could feel the entire structure starting to fail. Panic shot through him as he realized he might have to rebuild in the middle of the storm, an almost certainly fatal proposition. He braced himself against the failing wall, using his body weight to reinforce the frame while snow continued to pile against the exterior. The physical strain of holding the shelter together while fighting off hypothermia pushed Marcus to his limits. His muscles cramped from the cold and constant tension. Several times he caught himself drifting towards sleep, only to jolt awake when his grip loosened and the shelter shifted dangerously. Sleep would mean death, but staying awake was becoming its own form of torture. At some point during the endless night, Marcus began talking to himself, then to his grandfather, and finally to his parents. The conversations felt real in his exhausted state, and he found himself explaining his situation out loud, describing each challenge and solution as if the old man was sitting beside him. The sound of his own voice, even barely audible over the wind, provided a small comfort against the overwhelming isolation. When the wind finally began to diminish, the sudden relative quiet was almost more unsettling than the storm had been. Marcus lay still for several minutes, afraid to believe it might actually be over. His ears rang in the newfound silence, and every small sound seemed amplified. The shelter creaked and settled around him, damaged but still standing. As the first grey light of dawn filtered through the snow-caked entrance, Marcus forced himself to move. His joints protested every motion, and his hands shook uncontrollably as he began the careful process of digging himself out. The world that greeted him was transformed. Snow drifts reached above his head, and familiar landmarks had been completely erased by the storm's fury. But he was alive. Against all odds, through the worst night of his life, he had survived. As Marcus stood in the aftermath of the blizzard, looking out at a landscape that seemed more alien than anything he'd ever imagined, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about getting home anymore. The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead as Marcus pressed himself against the rocky outcropping, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the sparse canopy of stunted pines, he could see the aircraft circling, its searchlight cutting through the morning mist like a blade. His first instinct was to wave, to scream, to do anything to get their attention. But something held him back, a nagging voice in his head that sounded suspiciously like his grandfather's. Marcus gripped his makeshift spear tighter, remembering the strange conversation he'd overheard between the 2 men yesterday. They hadn't sounded like search and rescue. They'd sounded like hunters, and he was starting to suspect he might be the prey. The helicopter made another pass, lower this time. Marcus could make out 2 figures inside, one piloting, another scanning the ground with binoculars. Neither wore the bright orange vests or official markings he'd expect from a legitimate rescue operation. Instead, they were dressed in dark, tactical gear that made his stomach clench with unease. As the aircraft moved off toward the eastern ridge, Marcus forced himself to think logically. If these weren't rescuers, then who were they? And why would anyone be looking for him specifically? He was nobody special, just a kid from Seattle who'd gotten separated from a hiking group. Unless the realization hit him like a physical blow. His father's work. Dad had been increasingly paranoid lately, talking in hushed tones on encrypted phone calls, hiring additional security for their house. Marcus had assumed it was just typical corporate espionage stuff. His father's tech company was worth billions after all. But what if it was something more serious? What if someone had decided the best way to get to Richard Chen was through his son? The helicopter's sound faded into the distance, but Marcus remained motionless for another 10 minutes, watching and listening. When he was certain it was gone, he emerged from his hiding spot and assessed his situation with new urgency. If people were actively hunting him, his entire survival strategy needed to change. He couldn't just wait for rescue anymore. He needed to actively evade capture while finding his own way out. Marcus pulled out his hand-drawn map and studied the terrain. According to his calculations, he was still roughly 15 miles from the nearest ranger station. The direct route would take him through open valleys where a helicopter could easily spot him. But there was another option, a more treacherous path through the narrow canyon system to the south. It would add days to his journey and force him to navigate some dangerous terrain, but it would also provide natural cover from aerial surveillance. He was folding the map when he heard voices. Marcus froze, every sense on high alert. The voices were distant but growing closer, carried on the wind from the direction the helicopter had gone. At least 2 men, maybe 3, moving through the forest with the heavy footsteps of people who weren't trying to be quiet. Moving as silently as his grandfather had taught him, Marcus gathered his few possessions and slipped deeper into the tree line. He found a dense thicket of undergrowth about 50 yards from his camp and settled in to observe. Within minutes, 2 figures emerged into the clearing where he'd spent the night. They were definitely not search and rescue. Both men wore military-style clothing and carried assault rifles with practiced ease. The taller one had a radio clipped to his vest, while his companion swept the area with the methodical precision of someone trained in tracking. They examined his cold fire pit, studied his footprints, and communicated in the clipped, efficient manner of professionals. "Kid's been here recently," the shorter one said, kneeling beside the ashes. "Fire's been out maybe an hour." "Smart little bastard," his partner replied. "Heard us coming and rabbited. Boss said he might be more capable than expected." Marcus's blood ran cold. They knew about his survival training. Somehow, they'd done their homework on him, which meant this definitely wasn't a random kidnapping attempt. This was planned, organized, and specifically targeted at him. The tall man spoke into his radio. "Eagle 1, this is Ground Team 2. We've got fresh sign at grid reference 4 to 7 Alpha. Subject is mobile and aware of our presence, requesting aerial sweep of the southern approaches." The response crackled back almost immediately. "Copy. Ground 2, be advised weather front moving in from the west. We've got maybe 4 hours of clear flying time before conditions deteriorate." 4 hours. Marcus filed that information away as the 2 men continued their search. If the weather turned bad enough to ground the helicopter, it would level the playing field considerably. He just had to stay ahead of them until then. As the men moved off in the wrong direction, Marcus began planning his escape route through the canyon system. The game had changed completely, but his grandfather's training had prepared him for this too. Now it was time to disappear. The storm hit harder than Marcus had anticipated. What started as light snowfall the previous evening had escalated into a full blizzard, turning his carefully constructed shelter into a cocoon of ice and wind. He pressed his back against the rear wall of the lean-to, feeling the structure shudder with each gust that roared through the valley. Marcus pulled his sleeping bag tighter around his shoulders, but the cold was relentless. His breath formed clouds that immediately crystallized and fell back onto his face. This was the kind of storm that killed people, even experienced outdoorsmen, the kind that Grandpa Joe had warned him about during their training sessions. "Nature doesn't care about your plans, boy," the old man's voice echoed in his memory. When she decides to flex her muscles, you either bend or break. A sharp crack echoed through the night, followed by a thunderous crash that made Marcus's heart skip. A tree had fallen somewhere nearby, probably loaded down with too much snow and ice. He listened intently, trying to determine if it had hit his shelter, but the wind made it impossible to pinpoint the source. The temperature was dropping fast. Marcus could feel it in the way the air bit at his exposed skin, in the way his breath came out in increasingly visible puffs. His thermometer, strapped to the outside of his pack, had read -15 degrees the last time he'd checked, and that was before the storm intensified. He fumbled for his headlamp and clicked it on, the LED cutting through the darkness to reveal his breath hanging in the air like fog. Ice crystals had formed on the inside walls of his shelter, and his water bottles were starting to freeze, despite being kept close to his body. This was survival in its rawest form. Not the controlled scenarios Grandpa Joe had put him through, but nature unleashing its full fury with no consideration for human life. Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest, not panic, but the sharp focus that came when death was a real possibility. He needed to make decisions, stay put and hope the shelter held, or try to improve his situation while he still had strength. The wind was coming primarily from the northwest, driving snow through the gaps in his lean-to's construction. If he could reinforce the windward side, he might be able to get a small fire going again. Marcus pulled on his boots and jacket, every movement deliberate and careful. In conditions like this, a single mistake could be fatal. He'd heard stories of people stepping outside their shelter in whiteout conditions and walking in circles until they froze, never finding their way back to safety just yards away. He tied one end of his paracord to the main support beam of his shelter and wrapped the other end around his wrist. The cord would be his lifeline, ensuring he could find his way back even if visibility dropped to 0. Then he pushed aside the tarp that served as his door and crawled into the storm. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving ice crystals into his face with stinging force. The world beyond his shelter had disappeared entirely, replaced by a swirling wall of white and grey. He could barely make out his own hands as he felt along the ground for the materials he needed. Working by touch, Marcus gathered armfuls of snow and began packing it against the windward wall of his lean-to, the old Inuit technique Grandpa Joe had taught him, using snow as insulation rather than fighting against it. The fresh powder was too light to provide much protection, but underneath he found older, more compact snow that packed solid. His hands were going numb despite his gloves, and several times he had to stop and warm them against his body. The paracord around his wrist had already saved him twice when he'd become disoriented and started walking in the wrong direction. After what felt like hours, Marcus had built a substantial windbreak. The improvement was immediate. Inside his shelter, the howling diminished to a manageable whistle. He managed to clear enough space to rebuild his fire, using some of the birch bark he'd been saving for emergencies. The flames caught on the third try, and suddenly his small shelter felt like a palace. The temperature began to rise, and Marcus allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He'd weathered the worst nature could throw at him and come out stronger. But even as he warmed his hands over the fire, he knew the storm was far from over. The wind continued to rage outside, and he could hear more trees falling in the distance. This was only the beginning of what would be a very long night. The helicopter's rotors beat against the morning air like a mechanical heartbeat, growing louder as it approached the valley where Marcus had spent the last 4 days fighting for survival. He crouched behind a cluster of spruce trees, watching the aircraft circle overhead in wide, methodical sweeps. The bright orange and white Coast Guard colors were unmistakable against the gray Alaskan sky. His heart hammered in his chest, but not from relief. Something felt wrong. The helicopter made another pass, lower this time, and Marcus caught sight of movement through the trees below. Ground teams, at least 6 figures in bright safety vests, were moving through the forest in a coordinated search pattern, but they weren't alone. Marcus squinted, his stomach dropping as he recognized the bulky frame of Dale Hoffman among the searchers, the man who had deliberately led him away from the group, who had left him to die in this wilderness. was now part of his rescue team. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Dale couldn't afford for Marcus to be found alive and talking. Whatever his reasons for wanting Marcus dead, they were serious enough that he'd risk joining the search to ensure the job got finished. The helicopter began its descent toward a clearing about half a mile south of Marcus's position. He had minutes, maybe less, before the search teams reached his area. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one wearing a friendly face. Marcus gathered his makeshift spear and the small pack he'd fashioned from his torn jacket. The rabbit he'd caught that morning using his grandfather's snare technique would have to wait. Survival had just become infinitely more complicated. Moving carefully through the underbrush, he worked his way downhill, paralleling the search team's path, but staying well out of sight. His grandfather had taught him to read human movement patterns just like animal tracks, and these searchers were following textbook protocol, which made them predictable. The radio chatter carried through the thin air, fragments of conversation that made his blood run cold. Team 3, this is Dale. I'm breaking off to check the ravine system to the east. Kid might have fallen down there. Copy that, Dale. We'll maintain current sweep pattern. Marcus knew that ravine system. He'd scouted it yesterday looking for water sources. It was isolated, invisible from the helicopter, and full of deadly drop-offs. The perfect place for an accident to occur. He had a choice: try to reach the other searchers and hope they'd believe his story over Dale S., or disappear deeper into the wilderness until he could figure out how to expose the truth. The first option was faster but risky. Dale had 4 days to prepare his story, and Marcus was just a traumatized teenager who might be imagining threats after his ordeal. The second option meant more time in the wilderness, but it also meant staying alive long enough to prove what really happened. Marcus chose survival. He altered course, moving northwest toward a series of limestone caves his grandfather had once described from his own Alaska adventures. Natural shelters are worth their weight in gold, boy, but only if you know how to use them without becoming trapped. The helicopter made another pass overhead, closer this time. Marcus pressed himself against a fallen log, pulling pine boughs over his position. The aircraft hovered for nearly a minute before moving on, but he caught the glint of binoculars from the open door. They were looking for him specifically now, not just conducting a routine search pattern. His radio, the emergency beacon he'd been saving for exactly this moment, remained silent in his pocket. Using it would bring rescue, but it would also bring Dale. And in the confusion of a joyful reunion, who would believe that one of the adult supervisors had tried to commit murder? The afternoon wore on with Marcus playing a deadly game of cat and mouse through the wilderness. He used every technique his grandfather had taught him, moving through water to mask his scent, creating false trails, using natural camouflage to become invisible against the landscape. But he was growing tired, and his pursuers had resources he couldn't match indefinitely. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Marcus finally reached the cave system. The entrance was partially concealed behind a curtain of hanging moss and fallen rocks, exactly as his grandfather had described it 20 years ago. He paused at the threshold, listening carefully for any sounds that might indicate the caves were already occupied by bears or other predators. Hearing nothing but the distant drip of water, he slipped inside. The cave extended back into darkness, but Marcus could feel air movement that suggested multiple passages. Using his fire-starting skills, he created a small torch from birch bark and a straight branch. The flickering light revealed ancient stone formations and, more importantly, evidence that his grandfather had been here before. Carved into the cave wall, barely visible beneath decades of mineral deposits, were his grandfather's initials and a date from 1987. Below them, an arrow pointing deeper into the cave system. Marcus smiled grimly and followed the arrow into the darkness. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world that hurt Marcus's eyes even through his makeshift snow goggles. 3 days had crawled by since the avalanche, and his shelter had become both sanctuary and prison. The walls he'd built to protect himself now felt like they were closing in, but he knew better than to venture out while the weather raged. His stomach cramped with hunger, despite the careful rationing. The emergency rations were nearly gone, and the strips of rabbit meat he'd smoked were his lifeline now. Each piece had to last, had to count. Grandpa Joe's voice echoed in his memory. "Hunger's just another enemy, boy. You negotiate with it, but you never surrender." Marcus checked his snares first, heart sinking when he found them empty again. The storm had scattered the wildlife, sending everything deeper into whatever shelter they could find. He'd have to expand his hunting range, venture further from his camp despite the risks. The snow crunched under his improvised snowshoes as he worked his way down the slope, reading the landscape with eyes that had learned to see what others missed. There, a faint trail of tracks leading toward a cluster of stunted pines, ptarmigan, from the look of them. He followed the trail with patience that would have surprised his old classmates. The Marcus from Seattle moved fast, always rushing from one thing to the next. This Marcus had learned that survival meant slowing down, thinking 3 moves ahead like a chess master. The ptarmigan tracks led to a small clearing where the birds had been scratching for seeds beneath the snow. Marcus studied the area, noting wind patterns and sight lines. This wasn't just about finding food, it was about understanding the rhythms of this harsh world he'd been thrust into. He set up his position downwind, using techniques Grandpa Joe had drilled into him during those secret sessions in the mountains outside Seattle. The sling felt natural in his hands now, no longer the awkward tool it had been during his first desperate attempts. Hours of practice had transformed it into an extension of himself. The waiting was the hardest part. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. His feet went numb despite the extra socks he'd fashioned from torn clothing. But he'd learned patience from his grandfather, who could sit motionless for hours watching for the perfect shot. When the ptarmigan finally appeared, pecking cautiously at the snow, Marcus felt his heart rate slow rather than spike. Adrenaline sharpened his focus instead of making him shake. He selected his stone carefully, smooth, heavy enough for impact, shaped for accuracy. The first bird fell with barely a sound. The others scattered, but Marcus had already marked their flight pattern. He followed at a distance, knowing they'd land again within a few hundred yards. 3 hours later, he returned to camp with 2 ptarmigan, feeling like he'd won a small war against the wilderness. But as he prepared the birds, his mind was already working on the bigger picture. The search and rescue teams had given up by now. He was sure of it. That meant any chance of getting home lay entirely in his own hands. He pulled out his father's compass, checking his bearings against the crude map he'd been sketching. The mining road lay somewhere to the northeast, but reaching it meant crossing at least 20 miles of brutal terrain. In winter conditions, with minimal supplies, it was the kind of journey that killed experienced outdoorsmen. But staying put wasn't an option either. His shelter was solid, but it was temporary. The deeper winter got, the harder survival would become. Food would grow scarcer, the storms would get worse, and eventually, luck would run out. As he cooked the ptarmigan over his carefully maintained fire, Marcus made his decision. He'd spend 2 more days here, building up his strength and preparing supplies for the journey. He'd smoke every scrap of meat he could catch, repair his gear, and plan his route with military precision. The meat was tough but rich, sending warmth spreading through his chest. Each bite was a small victory, proof that he could do this impossible thing. He wasn't the helpless city kid everyone thought he was. Grandpa Joe had made sure of that, even if the old man never lived to see his training put to the ultimate test. Thunder rumbled overhead, another storm building in the distance. Marcus looked up at the darkening sky and felt something shift inside him. The fear was still there, but it was different now, controlled, useful. He'd stopped thinking about being rescued. This was bigger than that now. This was about proving he could walk out of hell on his own 2 feet, carrying nothing but the skills his grandfather had given him, and the determination that was purely his own. The storm could come. He'd be ready for it. The helicopter's rotors cut through the morning air like a metallic heartbeat, growing louder with each passing second. Marcus pressed himself against the rocky outcropping, his makeshift ghillie suit of pine boughs and moss helping him blend into the wilderness that had become both his enemy and salvation. After 8 days alone, the sound of civilization should have filled him with relief. Instead, his grandfather's voice echoed in his mind, "Trust your instincts, boy. Sometimes the thing that looks like salvation is just another kind of trap." Through the gaps in his camouflage, Marcus watched the aircraft circle the valley below. It wasn't a search and rescue helicopter. The sleek black machine bore no official markings, and its systematic grid pattern suggested something far more methodical than a missing person search. These weren't the people looking for a lost teenager. These were the same men who had been tracking him since he'd stumbled upon their operation 3 days ago. The memory still sent ice through his veins. He'd been following a game trail toward what he hoped was the main hiking route when he'd spotted the camp. At first glance, it had seemed like any other wilderness outpost, but something had felt wrong. The equipment was too sophisticated, the perimeter too organized. Then he'd seen the weapons cache and the maps marked with drop zones and smuggling routes, drug runners using the vast Alaskan wilderness as their personal highway, and they'd seen him too. The helicopter banked sharply, its downwash flattening the vegetation as it descended toward a clearing 50 yards from Marcus's hiding spot. 2 figures rappelled down before the aircraft lifted away, leaving them to continue the hunt on foot. Marcus recognized the taller one's distinctive red beard from the camp. These weren't casual criminals. They moved with military precision, their gear professional grade. Marcus forced his breathing to slow, drawing on every lesson his grandfather had drilled into him during their weekend training sessions back in Colorado. "Panic kills faster than cold or hunger," the old man always said. "Stay calm, stay smart, stay alive." The irony wasn't lost on him. His parents had always disapproved of those weekend trips, calling them a waste of time that could be better spent on academics or normal teenage activities. They'd never understood why Marcus was drawn to his grandfather's unconventional wisdom, why he'd chosen to learn about wilderness survival instead of video games or social media. Now that knowledge was the only thing standing between him and a shallow grave in the Alaskan wilderness. The 2 men approached his position with practiced stealth, their eyes scanning the terrain with the systematic thoroughness of experienced hunters. The red-bearded man carried a rifle with a scope, while his partner wielded what looked like a military-grade tracking device. They were following his trail, and despite his best efforts to mask his passage, they were gaining ground. Marcus's hand moved instinctively to the weapon at his side, not a gun or knife, but something his grandfather had taught him to craft from materials found in any forest. The atlatl was perhaps humanity's oldest projectile weapon, a simple wooden lever that could triple the force behind a thrown spear. It looked primitive compared to his pursuer's sophisticated gear, but Marcus had spent years perfecting his technique. More importantly, it was silent. The bearded man passed within 20 feet of Marcus's position, close enough that Marcus could hear him breathing. The criminal's eyes swept the rocks where Marcus hid, but the carefully constructed camouflage held. For a moment, it seemed they might pass by entirely. Then Marcus's foot shifted slightly, dislodging a small stone that clattered down the slope. Both men spun toward the sound, weapons raised. The bearded one barked orders into his radio while his partner began climbing toward Marcus's hiding spot. There was nowhere to run. The rocky outcropping offered concealment but no escape route. Marcus gripped his atlatl tighter, the carved wooden handle smooth from years of practice. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper in the wind. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. When that happens, you have 2 choices: become prey or remind them why humans ruled this planet long before we had bullets and helicopters. The second man was 15 feet away now, close enough that Marcus could see the predatory gleam in his eyes. The criminal was enjoying the hunt, confident in his technological advantage over a lost teenager. He had no idea what kind of prey he was actually stalking. Marcus drew back his arm, feeling the familiar weight of the spear as the atlatl's leverage multiplied his strength. 8 days of survival in the harshest environment on Earth had stripped away every trace of the soft city kid his parents thought he was. What remained was something harder, more dangerous, something his grandfather would have recognized and approved of. The man took another step forward, and Marcus struck. The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead as Marcus pressed himself against the rocky outcropping, his makeshift spear clutched tightly in his frost-bitten hands. Through the swirling snow, he could see the aircraft circling the valley below, searchlights cutting through the grey dawn like desperate fingers reaching for him. He wanted to run toward them, screaming and waving, but something held him back. Call it instinct, call it paranoia, but after 11 days alone in this frozen hell, Marcus had learned to trust his gut above all else. The helicopter wasn't from the search and rescue operation. The markings were wrong, the flight pattern too aggressive. And there was something else, the way it lingered over his previous campsites, the methodical way it courted the terrain. They weren't just looking for a lost hiker. Marcus thought back to the strange men he'd glimpsed 3 days ago, the ones with military-grade equipment who'd been tracking something through the wilderness. At first he'd assumed they were part of the search effort, but their behavior had been all wrong. They moved like hunters, not rescuers. The helicopter banked sharply and began moving up the valley toward his position. Marcus scrambled deeper into the rock formation, his grandfather's voice echoing in his memory sometimes. The best way to survive is to become invisible, boy. Predators always look for movement first. His stomach cramped with hunger. The rabbit he'd caught yesterday was long gone, and his snares had come up empty this morning. The unconventional hunting method his grandfather had taught him, using patience, improvised weapons, and an almost supernatural ability to read animal behavior, had kept him alive so far, but his body was running on fumes. The helicopter passed directly overhead, its downdraft sending loose snow cascading over his hiding spot. Through a gap in the rocks, Marcus caught a glimpse of tactical gear and wondered what he'd stumbled into. This wasn't about a missing teenager anymore. When the aircraft finally moved on, Marcus waited another 20 minutes before emerging. The sun was climbing higher, but the temperature remained brutally cold. He needed to move, needed to find food, and most importantly, needed to figure out why armed men were hunting through these mountains. Following a game trail down toward the tree line, Marcus spotted fresh tracks in the snow, not human, but something that made his pulse quicken. Wolf prints, and recent ones. A pack had passed through here within the last few hours. His grandfather's training kicked in automatically. Marcus studied the tracks, noting the size and gait patterns. 5 animals moving with purpose rather than randomly wandering. They were hunting too, which meant there was prey nearby. He followed the trail for half a mile before spotting movement through the trees ahead. A small herd of caribou had taken shelter in a grove of stunted pines, and the wolves were positioning themselves for an ambush. Marcus crouched behind a fallen log, watching the ancient drama unfold. The lead wolf emerged from cover, driving the caribou toward where the rest of the pack waited in concealment. It was textbook predator behavior, and Marcus realized he could use it to his advantage. Moving carefully to stay downwind, he positioned himself along the caribou's likely escape route. His makeshift spear felt inadequate against such large prey, but desperation had a way of making impossible shots possible. The wolves struck with coordinated precision. The caribou scattered in panic, crashing through the underbrush in their desperation to escape. A young bull broke away from the herd and charged directly toward Marcus's position, eyes wide with terror. Marcus didn't think. He reacted. Rising from concealment, he drove his spear forward with every ounce of strength his exhausted body could muster. The sharpened point, hardened in his campfire the night before, caught the animal just behind the shoulder blade. The impact drove him backward into the snow, but the spear held true. The caribou stumbled, fought against the weapon, then collapsed just yards away from where Marcus lay gasping. The wolves appeared moments later, surrounding the fallen animal and eyeing Marcus with predatory calculation. For a heartbeat, boy and pack stared at each other across the blood-stained snow. Then the lead wolf made a decision. With a low growl, it turned away, leading the pack deeper into the forest. They would find other prey. Marcus waited until they were gone before approaching his kill. His hands shook as he pulled out his utility knife, not from cold this time, but from the reality of what he'd just accomplished. 11 days ago, he'd been a city kid worried about pop quizzes and weekend plans. Now he was something else entirely. The distant sound of the helicopter returning made him look up sharply. Whoever was out there, they weren't giving up, but neither was he. Marcus began the grim work of field dressing his kill, knowing that survival meant embracing parts of himself he'd never imagined existed. The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead as Marcus pressed himself against the rocky outcropping, his makeshift signal mirror catching the morning sun. 3 days of following the river downstream had brought him to this wind-swept ridge where the forest opened, into a valley that stretched toward distant mountains. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "When you're ready to be found, make yourself impossible to miss." The aircraft banked sharply, circling back. Marcus waved the emergency blanket he'd fashioned from the silver interior of his jacket, the material snapping like a flag in the mountain wind. Below, the pilot's voice crackled through speakers, though the words were lost in the rotor wash. His legs trembled, not from cold this time, but from exhaustion and relief. The rabbit snares had provided enough protein to keep him moving, and the survival skills his grandfather had drilled into him during countless weekend trips had proven their worth. But the psychological toll of 3 days alone in the wilderness, knowing that every decision could mean life or death, had pushed him to his limits. The helicopter descended toward a relatively flat area near the river, kicking up clouds of dust and dried leaves. As the engines wound down, Marcus saw familiar figures emerging from the aircraft. His heart lurched when he spotted his parents among the rescue team, his mother's face streaked with tears even from this distance. "Marcus!" His father's voice carried across the clearing as the man broke into a run, his usual composed demeanor completely abandoned. The reunion was a blur of crushing embraces and broken sentences. His mother's hands fluttered over his face and shoulders as if confirming he was real. "We thought," everyone said. She couldn't finish, but she didn't need to. Marcus understood the grim statistics of teenagers lost in Alaska's backcountry. "I'm okay," he said, his voice hoarser than he'd realized. "Grandpa taught me well." The rescue team leader, a weathered man named Sullivan, approached with professional interest. "Son, you've been missing for 72 hours. Most folks don't last one night out here without proper gear. How did you manage it?" Marcus gestured toward his improvised shelter, still visible on the slope above. "I remembered what my grandfather taught me about reading the landscape. Found water first, then shelter, then food sources." He pointed to the nearly invisible snare lines he'd set along game trails. Had to adapt his techniques to what was available. Sullivan examined the snares with obvious respect. "These are expertly crafted. Your grandfather military?" "Vietnam," Marcus's father answered, his arm still wrapped protectively around his son's shoulders. "He's been taking Marcus on survival training since he was 10, but we never thought—" "You never thought I was actually listening," Marcus finished with a weak smile. "I know you both worried I was just humoring him." As they walked toward the helicopter, Marcus retrieved his pack and the small collection of tools he'd improvised. A fishhook carved from bone, cordage twisted from plant fibers, a firebow that had served him faithfully each night. The rescue team watched with growing amazement as he explained each item. "The hardest part wasn't the survival skills," Marcus admitted as they secured him in the aircraft. "It was staying calm enough to use them. Grandpa always said panic kills faster than cold or hunger." During the flight to the ranger station, his mother held his hand while Sullivan radioed ahead with updates. Through the headphones, Marcus could hear fragments of conversation about search teams being called off, about the miraculous recovery of the presumed deceased miner. "There's going to be media attention," Sullivan warned. 16-year-olds surviving alone in the wilderness. It's the kind of story that gets picked up nationally. Marcus looked down at the vast expanse of forest rolling beneath them, remembering the profound silence of his solitary camp last night. He'd lain awake listening to the night sounds, owl calls, the distant howl of wolves, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, and felt simultaneously more vulnerable and more capable than ever before in his life. "Will they believe it was just survival training?" he asked. His father squeezed his shoulder. "Your grandfather's going to be insufferably proud when he hears about this. All those weekends we thought he was just keeping you busy." "He was preparing me," Marcus said quietly. "He always said the wilderness doesn't care how old you are or where you come from. It only cares whether you respect it enough to learn its rules." As the helicopter descended toward the landing zone, Marcus could see news vans already gathering in the parking area. His 3 days of solitude were definitively over. Soon there would be questions, interviews, probably book offers and speaking requests. The thought was almost as daunting as facing another night alone in the forest. But he also felt something else, a quiet confidence that hadn't existed before his ordeal. He'd tested himself against genuine danger and emerged not just alive but stronger. The rescue helicopter's rotors beat a steady rhythm overhead as Marcus watched the search team pack their equipment. 3 days of tracking, of following the subtle signs his grandfather had taught him to read, had led them to the poachers' camp hidden deep in the Denali backcountry. The man who had been hunting illegally in protected territory and had tried to eliminate Marcus as a witness now sat in restraints, glaring silently at the ground. Sarah Chen approached, her ranger uniform still bearing dirt stains from their pursuit through the wilderness. "You sure you're okay, Marcus? That was some serious stuff back there." Marcus flexed his shoulder where the poacher's bullet had grazed him. The wound was superficial, but it served as a stark reminder of how close things had come. "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." She studied his face with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of traumatized hikers. "You don't look like someone who just spent 5 days lost in the wilderness being hunted by an armed man." "That's because I wasn't really lost." Marcus gazed across the vast expanse of Alaskan wilderness stretching in every direction. "For the first time in my life, I actually knew exactly where I was." Detective Rodriguez joined them, closing his notebook after interviewing the captured poacher. "Kid's story checks out completely. This guy's been operating out here for months, taking trophy animals and selling parts on the black market. When Marcus stumbled onto his operation, he panicked." Sarah nodded. "The evidence we found at his camp should put him away for a long time. Federal charges for poaching in a national preserve, plus attempted murder." She turned to Marcus. "Your testimony is going to be crucial." "Whatever you need," Marcus said. He thought about his grandfather's lessons on responsibility and doing what's right, even when it's difficult. Someone has to speak for those animals. The approaching sound of another helicopter drew their attention. Marcus recognized the Forest Service markings as it circled for landing. When the door opened, his parents rushed out before the rotors had fully stopped, followed by his hiking group leader, Mr. Peterson, whose face was a mask of guilt and relief. His mother reached him first, crushing him in an embrace that knocked the wind from his lungs. "Marcus, oh God, Marcus, we thought—" "I'm okay, Mom. Really." He returned her hug, surprised by how good it felt to see them again. Behind his mother, his father stood awkwardly, clearly struggling with emotions he wasn't used to expressing. "Son," his father began, his voice rough, "when we got the call that you were missing—" "I know, Dad. I know." Mr. Peterson stepped forward, his usual authoritative demeanor replaced by something approaching humility. "Marcus, I owe you the biggest apology of my life. We never should have left you behind. I take full responsibility for what happened." Marcus studied the man who had dismissed him so quickly as dead weight. "You couldn't have known what was out there. But maybe next time, don't be so quick to write someone off." "There won't be a next time," Peterson said firmly. "I'm done leading wilderness expeditions. This was my wake-up call." As the group prepared to board the helicopter for the flight back to civilization, Sarah Chen pulled Marcus aside. "I've been thinking about what you did out here. The way you tracked, survived, even captured evidence against our poacher. Have you ever considered a career with the Park Service?" Marcus looked surprised. "I'm only 16. "I know. But you've got instincts that can't be taught, and skills most of our rangers take years to develop. When you're ready for college, look into our partnership programs. We could use someone like you." The helicopter ride back to Anchorage gave Marcus time to process everything that had happened. Below them, the wilderness that had been his home for 5 days spread out in endless green. He thought about his grandfather, about the lessons that had kept him alive and the unconventional hunting methods that had helped him track a dangerous criminal. His phone, dead for days, finally had signal as they approached the city. Messages poured in, friends from school who had seen the news reports, relatives expressing concern, even classmates who had never spoken to him before, suddenly interested in his story. But the message that made him smile was a brief text from his grandfather's old number sent by his grandmother. "Harold would be proud. Come home soon. We miss you." As the helicopter touched down at the medical center where he'd be checked over one final time, Marcus realized that his ordeal in the Alaskan wilderness had ended exactly where his real journey was beginning. He was no longer the overlooked city kid trying to prove himself. He was someone who had found his place in the world and, more importantly, found himself. The adventure was over, but somehow Marcus knew his story in the wilderness was just getting started.